Good morning, dear friends, from a foggy, wonderful morning on a late summer on the Oregon coast. It's the year 2012. My name is Schupbach and I am part of the Deep Democracy Institute. We are a global think and feel tank, I guess, that is worldwide consulting, training, and fostering, supporting public dialogue on important issues. Deep democracy is Arnold Mindel's concept of bringing the world of spirit, or let's say unspeakable connections to the whole, that many of us have moments that we feel that, together with the world of feelings, subjective experiences that belong to us, and the world of facts and results. Those three worlds are parallel universes according to deep democracy, and all deserve a voice to be heard, like all the communities and all the people. The interviews that you're going to be seeing in this series are on climate change. It's part of the Deep Democracy Institute's initiative to create a public dialogue among stakeholders on climate change. Now, who's a stakeholder? In climate change, everybody's a stakeholder. The universe is a stakeholder because here's our planet and we are somehow special, we think. The earth is a stakeholder and all the sentient beings, animals, people, plants are on it. But of course also, especially today, the different nations, regions and government, the scientific community, business, media, public. We all have our own stakes, our own interests, our own views, and our own perspectives. Stakeholder dialogues allow common ground and common action, while especially including all the diversity and different opinions. It's a consensus-based idea where we can all pull in the same direction. Also, we might be pulling at different ends. So let's conflict and collaborate on the topic of stakeholders. You're going to see several interviews, films on this topic, and we hope that this is being seen as a brainstorming initiative that will allow you to form your own opinions, your own action, and do and conflict with what you think is the right thing for you. So, here we go. A special thank you to Professor Catherine Gauthier from the University of Santa Barbara, and to Dr. Amy and Arnold Mindel. The three of them, joined later by Professor Jeffrey Keel from Boulder, Colorado, were the initiators of stakeholder deep democracy, stakeholder dialogues on climate change, beginning with an open forum in Portland in the summer of 2012. Enjoy those interviews and hope to see you in other occasions. Bye-bye. My name is Max Schupbach and I am part of the Deep Democracy Institute, headquartered in Portland. And we met in connection with an open forum on climate change that a number of physicists, scientists, and Arnold and Amy Mindel conducted in Portland, in Oregon. And you were very friendly and open and consented to being interviewed by us for your view on people, psychology, pressing time problems and climate change. So thank you for that.
Yeah, well, thank you for having me with you. You know, climate change and just Earth issues in general are a very powerful topic for me, and I spend a lot of my time researching them and writing about them, among other things. So, you know, it's something that I feel very strongly about and am always happy to discuss in quite some detail with whoever wants to discuss it.
Great. Maybe you could say a few words about who you are, where you live, and what you do for the people who are not familiar with your work.
Yeah, so my name's Bonnie Bright, and I am based in the San Francisco Bay Area. And I am currently in the process of completing my dissertation in depth psychology. A lot of people will be familiar with Jungian psychology, and a lot of times the terms Jungian psychology and depth psychology are used interchangeably because Jung was one of the pioneers, along with Freud and a couple of others, who really started the whole movement of depth psychology. Depth psychology is really about looking what's behind, between, beneath the surface meaning of things. It's really about understanding symbols and how things are conveyed to us from perhaps a part of ourselves and a part of the world and the universe, in fact, that we don't always see right up front. Sometimes the invisible parts of us that have been hidden away for whatever reason. And so depth psychology is, it can be a challenging field, but it's also very rich and fertile when you start digging into cultural issues, for example, or earth-based issues or psychological issues, because there's a lot there to be revealed if only you're willing to look and to listen.
Mm-hmm. Well, this leads me actually to something that I'm been thinking about and our group has been playing with and working on. You gave a seminar together with Jeff Keel in Portland on the possibility of psychology, the power of psychology in helping us to deal with the climate change and possible lifestyle changes. And what would you say to something that we hear a lot, and people say, how can depth psychology help? This is not a depth psychological issue. These are outer issues. There's a whole scientific debate. Well, to some extent, that's a whole other topic that we won't touch much upon today probably. So in your view, depth psychology, how can it help an everyday person to deal with the changes that might come towards us with climate change?
Mm-hmm. Well, first of all, depth psychology is really about the whole, as in WHOLE, the wholeness of something. Mm-hmm. And so, first of all, I just want to say it's really important that all of these people, all of these voices are heard in this particular topic and in any topic, because, you know, the scientists have their place, psychologists have their place, the general public have their place, but what's really important is to be able to bring all of those together. Mm-hmm. And the second thing I would say is depth psychology is really actually far more about asking questions than coming up with set answers. Mm-hmm. So what that means is that it's kind of I view it as kind of a constantly flowing and changing sort of thing, where once you come up with some kind of an answer, that begins to become a little more rigid and fixed, and then all of a sudden it may not be the best solution to any given problem that arises. And so it's a lot about asking questions and to some extent I would say being comfortable not necessarily having set answers. Now, it's not that we don't need some answers for this current situation that we're in, both with climate change and ecocide, the killing, the destruction of our planet and of our homelands and our home places. But there's something very powerful about being able to hold the questions and hold the tension that arises when we start to realize the magnitude of what it is that's going on without sort of fleeing the center, without sort of abandoning ourselves and abandoning our capacity to be able to just hold that and wait for those answers to come into us. Mm-hmm. It's not to say we shouldn't take action, but what's really important is to be able to also make some space that maybe was not there before or that we aren't currently able to make, because we have all of these things that are filling up that space. And so it's allowing and making that space so that something new can emerge, some kind of a new creative solution can come in and infuse us and engage with us.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I love how you say that, and I mean that also reverberates with our goal from the Deep Democracy Institute. So thank you so much for that perspective. I thought today, if you were you're a cultural facilitator / you're a cultural therapist, if there was such a thing. Mm-hmm. I guess there is. Then let's say you would have a client, it was the Earth, and the Earth would have like a dream and would come to you and say, what should I do? I dreamt last night that I was heating up, everything was getting warmer, and what should I do? In your mind, what's your perspective? What could a dream like that mean for the Earth?
Yeah, thank you for saying that. And I really appreciate the image that you bring up of a cultural therapist. I think it's not my term, and certainly some other people are beginning to use that more and more, but it's really the idea of being able to look at what's around us and what our practices are as humans and begin to question them and to understand where we are falling short and what things may be missing in our culture and what things we need to be able to also sort of work on and address. And, you know, when it comes to the Earth, actually, it's not such a far stretch for some of us to think about the Earth as being able to dream. And in fact, some people have said that the Earth is, in fact, dreaming us. And if that's the case, then that gives us a huge amount of responsibility toward the Earth. You know, for historically, Earth-based peoples and indigenous peoples have long believed that the Earth and everything essentially on it has its own intelligence, its own self-awareness, and its own capacity to think and to dream. And they treated the Earth and the environment as such, so they would be able to engage with the animals. They would be able to engage with plants and things in nature and with the Earth itself. And so, you know, this idea that the Earth might be dreaming that it's becoming too hot, or that there are toxins in the Earth, or that it's being completely violated and ripped apart, I mean, that's really not a stretch. And there's a very interesting book, actually, by a Jungian analyst named Jerome Bernstein. It's called Living in the Borderlands. And he hypothesizes there that the Earth and nature are actually trying to reach out to us as humanity to sort of reestablish the balance that has really been broken. Because over the course of centuries, as we have developed our rational mind and the so-called Enlightenment, we have really created this hierarchy where humans have begun to conquer nature. With science, we have begun to manipulate nature. We've started to make all these changes, and so we no longer have a reciprocal relationship with Earth and nature, but we have the masters. And it's a problem, because therefore we are, by making nature into dead matter instead of a living being that has its own thoughts, feelings, and awareness, we're able to then treat it in such a way that we wouldn't otherwise if we really believed it were a living being. And so therefore we're able to use it, abuse it, take advantage of its resources, which, you know, some people would quibble over that resources.
I understand. Again, you know, I'm like very intrigued and love what you say. It goes along a lot in many ways how we think. But here's a question for you. What would you say if you had a third person sitting in here? It's people that we hear quite a bit to say, okay, I can see the truth in Aboriginal wisdom, I can see the truth in some of the cosmologists of indigenous people. That's a good direction, but we can't turn the clock back. What you expect us? You expect us to go back? How do we bring modern science, our economy-driven lifestyles together with those values from the past? Is there a way how we can move forward in a new way to make that happen? Or are you suggesting we're going back, I'm exaggerating now, weaving our own clothes and growing our own tomatoes, or what's your viewpoint on this, Bonnie?
Yeah, that's a good question. I have to agree with you. I don't feel that there's, I mean, you know, some people may romanticize that idea of going backward, but first of all, I'm a big believer in technology, and I do think that technology and science both have very powerful impacts on what we're able to do and our capacity to do it. The challenge is when we adopt those things completely without bringing imagination into the puzzle. And I do believe that as a species, we have really lost our capacity to imagine a world that can be quite different. We've become very adapted to the status quo, and just because we look around and everybody's doing the same thing, we continue to be able to justify our own behaviors. And, you know, most of us, on some level, feel that we need to make some changes to the way that we are living our lives. That is, we need to be cutting down on our carbon emissions, we need to be recycling, we need to be doing what we can do in our daily lives to be able to cut back on these things. But the problem is that we still all believe that we have to go out and get in our car. Well, I shouldn't say all, because obviously some people are changing that, and that's good. But a lot of us, myself included, still think that we have to go out and get in our car and drive somewhere, or to even take a bus. I mean, there's still a lot of emissions that are coming out of those. We have not actually transcended that level where we can imagine something completely different than relying on, for example, fossil fuels, or living our lives consuming a certain amount of power or electricity in our homes, or watching TV every day and leaving it running when we leave the room, or whatever it is. So we really need to find a way to, again, make that space in our lives to just allow new ways of imagining living our lives to come in, and then work together, you know, from both a behavioral standpoint, from the way that we think about and imagine things, and also with the hard facts of what is actually going on our planet right now, and how urgent it's starting to become.
Well, what would you, it's such great answers, and very stimulating. I find it very inspiring. I'm thinking back now of conversation that it's not directly related to climate change, but in terms of the polarities, there might be some similarities. I lived in Oregon during the time when the spotted owl was suddenly discovered as an endangered species, and it resulted in a logging stop. And we live on the Oregon coast, right on the tip of a big logger area, and in the back from where we live, there's like 4 or 5 of these logger towns. And the protection of the spotted owl and the stopping of clear cut was hailed as a big progress for environmentalists and the green movement. And I'm sorry, I remember driving through these logging towns crying because I saw families hungry. I saw people out of work over a long period of time, and not being really equipped to deal with it. There was barely any programs, and also I was very much on that side. I was upset about I was upset with myself for not having realized earlier that changes like that are complicated for all sides. So what would you say, for example, to the groups that say, listen, economy is important to us, we have like unemployment, we have to get our economy together. Climate change, we can deal with that later. Let's focus on the economy. Let's focus to continue our normal lifestyle and add profit. What would you say to a side like that from a depth psychological viewpoint?
Well, you know, there's a term that occurs to me, which all of us are familiar with on some level, and that is this idea of entitlement. And I would balance that word by using the word unfair or fair. You know, I'm really touched by your response to this idea of driving through these towns and seeing how much people were suffering because of environmental issues. And of course, we have on a daily basis examples of, for example, indigenous people who have been forced out of their native lands because an area has been determined to be a refuge for, you know, the forestry, or for a certain animal, or, you know, these people that have lived there for generations and if not millennia are often having to leave and no longer able to hunt or to be able to take advantage of the lands that they have lived on all their lives, and that their grandmothers and grandfathers have lived on, because it's being protected. But in the end, it ends up hurting them. And the same thing, you know, I mean, there are a lot of Western countries, or I would call them maybe consumer-driven countries, that are making a lot of they're creating a lot of the emissions. They're making a lot of the decisions about where we need to be, you know, cutting down the wood and what kinds of things we need. And yet there are a lot of people in other countries who are not able to be part of those decisions. They have no choices. And yet they're the ones who are being hurt first. They're the ones who are being forced out of their homes because big oil has come in and created a toxic oil spill and they can't live there anymore, or because the land has become so clear-cut that there's nothing left for them to burn, create for cooking. So, you know, I think it's a matter of us really rather than coming to that impasse with the two sides, I mean, we can't just let the economy go completely, but we really need to bring our own emotions into it. And I mean at the level of leadership as well, where we begin to look at each one of these situations individually and allow the humanity of it to come through and start making some decisions that are going to entitle people or certain countries less, and actually engage and help certain countries and others a little more. Because there's just a way we can continue this kind of extreme polarization where people have, some people just don't have any of it. And that includes the to contribute to the choices that are being made regardless.
Yeah, well, I mean, you're highlighting a point that we see a lot in our work, which is if you use, you mentioned the word whole, if you use a systemic view during the Portland meeting, and that is actually what led to this interview. I was especially struck where at one point the point was being made that the countries that at the moment suffer the most from global warming are frequently countries that are in the warmer areas already, and they're close to sea level, and those are in many cases not so-called first world. And we think this is not really our problem. I remember in that meeting I was very moved when you spoke out and said, well, we think here in the United States or in Europe this doesn't really affect us yet, but it affects these people. We don't think, where will these people go? Right. So in a way you can't say, well, climate change is not important, but immigration is, because they're directly connected.
Yes, they are. And what you're referring to is some numbers that have come both through the International Panel on Climate Change as well as through UNESCO and others that are predicting that there may be up to 200 million people who are displaced from their homelands because of climate change or environmental issues by the year 2050. That's not that far away. And what you're saying, and what has really touched me a lot, and I've spent a lot of time researching, is this whole idea of environmental migration, forced migration due to climate change and other reasons. You know, if the desertification in Africa is so bad that people can no longer graze their goats in a certain place, they're going to have to go somewhere. But not only that, people who are being flooded out, like in Bangladesh, which is a very low-lying area, they're going to have to go somewhere. And, you know, I saw at one point somebody suggested that maybe, this was on a documentary, that maybe the countries that are creating the most of the carbon emissions and contributing most to climate change should have to take in whatever percentage of people who are displaced and bring them into their own country and deal with them. I mean, imagine the town where you live. If you had to take in 10,000, 20,000, 30,000 people and put them somewhere and create homes and livelihoods and jobs and a place for their children to go to school. And, you know, all of a sudden we start to look at things differently when we begin to imagine how the world would be very different, even if we go about our daily lives in the U.S. thinking that, you know, it's not really affecting us. But I'll tell you something else. You know, we're doing this discussion right now in the middle of hurricane season, and we're starting to see, and we saw several years ago when Hurricane Katrina hit, how we are affected by this. Not only that, but wildfires and drought have been absolutely terrible this year in 2012, and they're just predicted to get worse and worse and worse. So even in our own country, there are areas that will not be very habitable at some point in the future. It may not be in our lifetime, but it will be in our children's or our children's children's lifetimes. And this is all stuff that it's easy to put off because we don't want to think about it. It's very difficult for us to think about it, particularly if we allow ourselves to feel emotion around it. But somebody needs to start feeling that emotion, or else we're not going to be able to move past this sort of stagnancy that we have on taking some kind of action around the things that desperately need to be done.
Wow, thank you. We unfortunately have to end. I could go on for hours. I have a last question for you. If you had a prompt or a wisdom or an advice or a question for people who have been watching through this entire conversation, what would it be?
Well, you know, Carl Jung, who again was the Swiss psychologist who was one of the pioneers of depth psychology, he spent a lot of time thinking about culture, and a lot of it he did in the mid-1900s. And so, you know, half a century has gone by since he really did a lot of his great thinking and writing, and of course he died in the early 1960s. And he's long gone now, but he really had the vision to sort of see what was going on then, and it's just become amplified since then. But he said that we've lost contact with our instincts, that we have really separated ourselves from that and come over to trust our thinking minds so much that we're unable to feel and be in touch with that instinctual urge, which I think we need to survive, right? I mean, if you look at the animal kingdom, they're the ones that survive are the ones that have that instinct to know when to do what. And Jung says that we're dominated by the goddess reason. So no longer are we, worshiping the old gods who used to bring us the things that we really needed. We've now turned to reason with a capital R, and we have let all the other gods go. And so I would just say, whatever you're doing in your life, just allow some space in it to question things and to allow something new to come in, and trust the instinct to come back into our bodies and into the earth and into the spaces around, and just see what needs to be done, because something's being asked of all of us.
Hey, thanks a lot. That was really great. Good luck with all your work, and thanks for making the time for that.